On September 3, 1260, Bibars, a Mamluk general, spurred his horse up a rugged path snaking through the hills of northern Palestine. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, extending long shadows across the Jezreel Valley below. Upon reaching the summit, he found Sultan Qutuz alongside a small contingent of guards, all eyes fixed on the valley floor, where a momentous event was about to unfold. Bibars knew what was coming. Within hours, his modest cavalry force would confront an adversary that had never suffered a permanent defeat in battle. An enemy whose dominion stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the very gates of Vienna. An enemy that had razed empires, incinerated cities, and left millions dead in its wake. The Mongols were approaching, confident in their inevitable victory. However, Bibars harbored a secret. It wasn't the hidden weapon, nor did it involve overwhelming numbers or superior training. The secret lay beneath his horse's hooves, embedded in the ancient soil of this land, in the very hills encircling this valley. Something so deceptively simple that the Mongols never anticipated it. Today, we delve into the tale of how the landscape itself became the instrument that shattered an empire. This is the saga of Ain Jalut, and I assure you, it's not the version you likely know. Before we plunge into one of history's most pivotal engagements, I have a small request. If you appreciate narratives where underdogs triumph through intellect over sheer might, where geography plays a vital role in historical dramas, please hit that like button. And for more in-depth explorations of battles that reshaped the world, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Believe me, you won't want to miss our upcoming content. Now, let's rewind a couple of years to fully grasp the apparent impossibility of this impending victory. In 1258, Baghdad, having thrived for 500 years, stood as the crown jewel of the Islamic world. It was home to the House of Wisdom, a hub where scholars from across the known world converged to advance studies in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The Abbasid Caliphate governed from this magnificent city, and its caliph was revered as the spiritual guide for millions of Muslims, extending from Spain to India. The city's libraries housed hundreds of thousands of volumes, representing centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Then, the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led an army estimated to exceed 100,000 warriors towards Baghdad's defenses. The caliph, al-Mustasim, made a fatal error in judgment. He believed his city's fortifications were impenetrable. He was convinced his standing as the leader of Islam would safeguard him. Perhaps he even thought divine intervention would occur. He was mistaken on every count. When Baghdad fell in February 1258, the Mongols spent a week systematically obliterating everything that had made it grand. So many books were cast into the Tigris River that eyewitnesses claimed the water turned black with ink. Scholars, artists, and scientists were executed. The death toll was so immense that estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million souls. The caliph himself was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, as Mongol superstition prohibited spilling royal blood directly onto the earth. Pause for a moment to consider that. The heart of Islamic civilization, a city that had endured longer than any European capital, was wiped out in mere days. And the Mongols? They proceeded as if merely ticking another item off their global conquest checklist. But here's the crucial point. Baghdad wasn't an anomaly. This was standard operating procedure for the Mongol war machine. From 1206, when Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, until 1260, the Mongols had forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They had vanquished the formidable Jin dynasty in China. They had annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. They had carved through Russia like a hammer through glass. They had invaded Poland and Hungary, striking fear across Europe. And they achieved all of this with a single, potent secret weapon that rendered them virtually invincible: their horses. Now, I anticipate your thought. __0_. However, the Mongol relationship with horses was fundamentally distinct. Grasping this distinction is vital to understanding both their unparalleled dominance and their eventual downfall. A Mongol warrior didn't merely ride a horse, he practically lived on horseback. From the moment a Mongol boy could walk, he was learning to ride. By adolescence, he could expertly fire a bow while galloping at full speed. He could sleep in the saddle. He could orient himself by the stars while mounted. The medieval Persian historian Juvayni remarked that Mongols were so at home on horseback that they seemed to be a singular entity akin to the centaurs of Greek mythology. Yet, the true brilliance of their system lay elsewhere. Every Mongol cavalryman typically brought 3 to 4 horses with him on campaign. Some accounts even suggest they had as many as 7 remounts each. The Mongol military's unique setup meant that their warriors could continuously swap to fresh mounts, achieving feats like covering 60 miles in a day, which was twice what a typical medieval army could manage. This allowed them to materialize unexpectedly, strike with overwhelming power, and vanish before any reinforcements could arrive. The Mongol horse itself was perfectly suited for their nomadic warrior lifestyle. Unlike the sturdy European war horses or the elegant Arabian steeds, the Mongol pony was compact and robust, standing merely around 4.5 feet at the shoulder. However, its small stature was compensated by incredible resilience. These horses sustained themselves on minimal forage, grazing on whatever scarce vegetation they encountered. They could withstand extreme temperatures, from intense summer heat to Siberian winters plunging to 40 degrees below zero. Essentially, they were the 13th century's equivalent of an SUV, built for endurance rather than swiftness or grace. A fascinating, albeit almost unbelievable detail well documented in historical accounts reveals that a Mongol warrior, when necessary, could make a small cut in his horse's neck, drink some blood for sustenance, then seal the wound and keep riding. The Persian chronicler Ata Malik Javani noted that a Mongol horseman could go 10 days without cooked food, surviving on horse blood and mare's milk. This eliminated the need for cumbersome supply trains, meaning the Mongol army had no fragile baggage to safeguard and no logistical hindrances to slow them down. Consider the profound strategic implications. European armies had to stick to roads due to heavy supply wagons and stay close to cities for provisions, making them slow, predictable, and easy to track. In contrast, the Mongols could traverse deserts, cross mountains, and appear in regions where an army was thought incapable of existing. They were the closest thing the medieval era had to a modern air cavalry unit. Highly mobile, self-sufficient, and capable of striking anywhere at any given moment. Their tactical approaches were equally groundbreaking. The Mongol army exhibited mathematical precision in its organization, structured into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. This decimal system facilitated complex battlefield maneuvers that would have been impossible for the feudal armies of Europe or the Middle East, where knights often prioritized individual glory over coordinated unit action. A characteristic Mongol battle strategy unfolded as follows. Light cavalry, equipped with potent composite bows, would harass the adversary from a distance, unleashing volleys of arrows while remaining just out of reach. Should the enemy charge to engage, the Mongols would execute their renowned feigned retreat. They would turn and flee, appearing to be in disarray, thereby luring the enemy into pursuit. The enemy, believing victory was theirs, would break formation to chase the retreating Mongols. And that's when the trap would be sprung. The fleeing Mongols would abruptly pivot, firing arrows backward from their saddles, using a technique known as the Parthian shot. Simultaneously, heavy Mongol cavalry, concealed nearby, would charge into the now disorganized enemy flanks. Mongol horse archers could encircle the enemy formation, shooting from all angles while maintaining sufficient mobility to evade counterattack. This was devastatingly effective against every foe, from Chinese pikemen to European knights and Muslim cavalry. At the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223, the Mongols employed this precise tactic against a coalition of Russian princes. The Russians, confident in their numerical superiority, pursued what they believed was a defeated Mongol force. The Mongols led them on a 9-day chase across the steppes. By the time the trap closed, the Russian horses were utterly exhausted, their men strung out in a vulnerable marching line, far from any support. The Mongols obliterated them. Of the 80,000 Russians who initiated the battle, only a minuscule fraction survived. This psychological warfare was as crucial as their military strategies. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered immediately were frequently spared, their populations allowed to live under Mongol governance. However, cities that resisted were utterly annihilated, their inhabitants massacred down to the last child, their buildings torched, and their fields salted. The Mongols intended for everyone to understand that resistance was futile, and surrender was the sole rational choice. By 1260, this strategy had proven effective for over half a century. No one had discovered a lasting way to stop them. Certainly, there had been tactical setbacks. The Mongols did lose some battles, but they invariably returned stronger, learned from their errors, and ultimately crushed any who had opposed them. They had vanquished every type of adversary: steppe nomads who fought similarly, Chinese infantry with advanced siege weaponry, European heavy cavalry, and Muslim horse archers. They had showcased their ability to triumph across all environments and terrains, ranging from the frigid Siberian tundra to the scorching Iraqi desert. Following Baghdad's capture, the Mongols directed their focus westward, towards Syria. Damascus, a city renowned as one of the world's continuously inhabited urban centers, yielded without resistance in March 1260. The Christian Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia and the Crusader Principality of Antioch had already accepted Mongol dominion and were supplying auxiliary troops. Consequently, the Mongols now held sway over a vast territory stretching from Korea to the Mediterranean Sea. Only one significant Muslim power remained: the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which the Mongols fully intended to incorporate into their extensive domain. To comprehend the Mamluks' identity and their decision to engage in battle rather than capitulate, an understanding of one of medieval Islamic society's most peculiar institutions is essential. The term Mamluk itself translates directly to owned or slave in Arabic. These Mamluks were enslaved boys, typically captured from the Turkic peoples of the Central Asian steppes or the Caucasus region. These young boys, generally between 8 and 12 years of age, were acquired by Muslim rulers and transported to Egypt, where they underwent a remarkable transformation. They were enrolled in what functioned as military academies. For years, and sometimes even decades, they underwent rigorous training in horseback riding, archery, swordsmanship, and wrestling. They honed their ability to unleash arrows with lethal precision while galloping at full speed. They delved into the intricacies of tactics and strategy. They committed the Quran to memory and embraced Islam. They forged unbreakable bonds with their fellow trainees, relationships that would endure throughout their lives. Here lies a fascinating paradox that might seem counterintuitive to contemporary sensibilities. Despite their technical status as enslaved individuals, Mamluks achieved prominent social standing. The most gifted among them could ascend to positions as generals, governors, or even sultans. In fact, in 1250, the Mamluks had overthrown their Ayyubid overlords in Egypt, establishing their own sultanate. The very slaves had ascended to become the rulers. Yet they never forgot their origins. They consistently remembered the demanding training, the bonds of brotherhood, and the absolute discipline instilled in them from childhood. In many respects, they presented a perfect counterpart to the Mongols, warriors raised in the saddle, proficient in steppe warfare, who fought as cohesive, disciplined units rather than as individuals pursuing personal glory. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultan was a man named Qutuz. His personal narrative is extraordinary. Born a prince in Central Asia, he was sold into slavery after the Mongols devastated his homeland. Through sheer competence and an unyielding will, he rose through the Mamluk hierarchy, ultimately seizing power in Egypt in 1259. Therefore, when Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo, bearing a letter demanding Egypt's surrender, for Qutuz, this was not merely a political calculation, it was deeply personal. Hulagu's letter warrants direct quotation, as it masterfully encapsulates the Mongol mindset of inevitable conquest. It declared, quote, Qutuz read this letter aloud to his council. Some advisors advocated for surrender, reasoning that everyone else who had resisted the Mongols had been decimated. Wasn't submission the only rational choice? Egypt was prosperous, yes, but could it truly stand against the horde that had subdued half the known world? Qutuz's definitive response was to order the execution of the Mongol envoys and display their heads prominently on Cairo's Bab Zuwayla Gate for all to witness. This was a direct declaration of war, delivered in the most uncompromising terms imaginable. There would be no surrender, no negotiations, no concessions. Egypt would either stand firm or perish fighting. This decision might appear to be sheer recklessness, the kind of impetuous choice that leads to the destruction of entire civilizations. However, Qutuz possessed knowledge that his advisors did not fully grasp. He recognized that the Mongols, despite their immense power, were not at their full strength. In 1259, the great Khan Monkey died while campaigning in China. This triggered a succession crisis back in Mongolia, and Mongol law mandated that all royal princes return to Karakoram to participate in the election of the new great Khan. Hulagu Khan had consequently departed Syria in late 1259, taking the majority of his monumental army with him. Some estimates suggest he withdrew over 100,000 men back eastward. He left behind only a small rearguard force under the command of his most trusted general, a Nestorian Christian Turk named Kitbuka. Estimates of Kitbuka's forces from medieval sources vary wildly, but modern historians place his strength at approximately 10,000 to 20,000 Mongol cavalry, supplemented by auxiliary troops from Georgia, Armenia, and Syria. This still represented a formidable military formation, composed of veteran Mongol warriors who had carved a path of conquest from Baghdad to Damascus. Nevertheless, it constituted a mere fraction of the army that had instilled terror across the Muslim world for the preceding 2 years. Qutuz recognized a critical opportunity. Swift action could allow him to engage Kitbuka's rearguard before Hulagu's reinforcements arrived. This was a calculated risk, yet it was the only strategy offering a glimmer of success. He rapidly assembled an army comprising roughly 20,000 Mamluk cavalry, alongside Bedouin tribal auxiliaries and other volunteers. What he did next underscored the desperate and precarious nature of his situation. He initiated negotiations with the Crusaders. This particular maneuver is remarkable. The Mamluks and Crusaders have been bitter adversaries for decades, engaging in innumerable conflicts for dominance over the Holy Land. Only a few years prior, they would have unhesitatingly slaughtered one another on sight. Yet, when Qutuz's envoys approached the Crusader stronghold of Acre, they discovered an unexpected willingness among the Crusaders to forge an agreement. The underlying reason was a crucial realization. The Mongols posed a far greater menace than the Muslims. Kitbuka had already devastated the Crusader city of Sidon following a dispute, and the Crusaders understood that if Egypt fell, their own territories would be next. Granting the Mamluks passage through Crusader lands was preferable to confronting the Mongol horde in isolation. Thus, in July 1260, the Mamluk army advanced northward, traversing territory controlled by their ancestral enemies without molestation. The Crusaders even permitted them to establish supply depots near Acre. This extraordinary alliance, born of sheer self-preservation, remains one of the most peculiar episodes in medieval history. Qutuz's forces then marched into Palestine, where a second pivotal figure enters our narrative, a Mamluk general named Baibars. Baibars is among the most captivating personalities of the medieval era, and it's genuinely astonishing that he isn't more widely recognized in the Western world. Born into a Turkic family in Central Asia, he was sold into slavery as a boy, but ascended through the Mamluk ranks to become one of their preeminent generals. He was also fiercely ambitious, utterly ruthless, and prepared to employ any means necessary to achieve victory. However, a specific detail is crucial for our story. Years earlier, when Baibars had fallen out of favor with the previous Mamluk Sultan, he had fled Egypt and spent time as a fugitive in Syria and Palestine. He had roamed through the very region where the impending battle would occur. He possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, the hills, valleys, springs, and narrow passes. He understood precisely where cavalry could operate effectively and where they could not. He held the key secret that would ensure victory. Collaborating, Qutuz and Baibars devised a strategy designed to turn the Mongols' own tactics against them. Before delving into the battle itself, we must address a seemingly mundane but ultimately critical element: horseshoes. I understand this might not be what you expected. You likely anticipated tales of epic cavalry charges and dramatic battlefield heroism, not a discussion of medieval farrier technology. Nevertheless, bear with me, as this detail is foundational. The Mongol horse, as previously mentioned, was extraordinarily hardy and could subsist on minimal provisions. These ponies had evolved on the vast steppes of Mongolia, primarily characterized by soft soil and grasslands. Their hooves were exceptionally tough and resilient, shaped over millennia by natural selection to thrive in that specific environment. On the steppes, Mongols had no need for horseshoes. The soft ground naturally maintained the hardness of their hooves. However, Mongolia and Syria possess vastly different geological characteristics. Syria, situated in the Levantine region, features a landscape dominated by rocky hills, limestone formations, and compacted earth. When unshod horses repeatedly traverse such terrain, their hooves can crack, chip, and become agonizingly bruised. A horse suffering from damaged hooves moves more slowly, becomes fatigued more quickly, and in severe cases can be rendered completely lame. The Mamluks, conversely, had been campaigning in this region for generations. Their horses were shod, meaning they had iron shoes nailed to their hooves, providing protection against the harsh, rocky ground. This seemingly minor disparity carried immense strategic implications. On the rugged terrain of Syria and Palestine, Mamluk horses could move with greater speed, sustain combat longer, and maneuver more efficiently than their Mongol counterparts. Yet a second and even more fundamental challenge confronted the Mongols: grass. Recall that a Mongol cavalryman typically had 3 to 4 horses, each requiring approximately 9 pounds of grass daily. Let's do the arithmetic. If Kitbuka commanded 15,000 Mongol cavalry, and each had 3 horses, that equates to a staggering 45,000 horses. With each horse consuming approximately 9 pounds of grass daily, the total feed requirement exceeded 400,000 pounds every day. These equine cohorts needed around 8 square miles of prime grazing land. Mongolia, famously blanketed in grasslands and aptly named the Eurasian steppe, offered vast expanses stretching for hundreds of miles, perfectly accommodating the Mongols' immense horse herds. Syria, however, presented a stark contrast. This semi-arid region possessed only scattered patches of grassland, a far cry from the limitless verdant seas the Mongols were accustomed to. Modern estimations suggest that the Syrian landscape could sustain perhaps 80,000 horses at most before severe overgrazing became an insurmountable issue. This figure, importantly, applied to horses at rest, not those engaged in combat or extended marches. Consequently, the Mongols were unable to deploy their customary overwhelming cavalry numbers in Syria. Their standard strategy of continually rotating to fresh mounts was unfeasible. Their horses faced a harsher environment, tougher terrain, and scarcer provisions. The Mamluks were acutely aware of this vulnerability. Historical accounts reveal the Mamluks' deliberate scorched earth tactics in certain areas, setting fire to grasslands to deny their use to the Mongols. This was, in essence, medieval resource denial warfare, executed with brutal effectiveness. Let's now consider the terrain of the Jezreel Valley itself, where geographical features became a tactical weapon. This triangular plain, located in northern Israel, spans roughly 30 miles from Mount Carmel in the west to the Jordan River Valley in the east. It's a historically fertile region and has been the setting for innumerable conflicts due to its strategic position as a natural invasion corridor. Any military campaign moving from Syria towards Egypt would invariably traverse this valley. Its defining characteristic lies in its topography. While the valley floor is relatively flat and expansive, ideal cavalry country, precisely what the Mongols favored, it is encircled by hills and low mountains. Mount Gilboa rises to the south, the hills of Lower Galilee define its northern edge, and Mount Tabor looms to the northeast. These aren't barren, windswept heights, rather they are thickly wooded and dotted with rocky outcrops. The forthcoming battle was destined to occur near a spring known as Ain Jalut, which translates to Goliath's Spring in Arabic. Legend maintained that this was the very spot where the biblical David had vanquished Goliath millennia earlier. The spring is nestled at one of the valley's narrowest points, where the encircling hills draw particularly close. Baibars, upon surveying this landscape, recognized a unique opportunity. The open valley floor would naturally draw the Mongols in, providing perfect conditions for their cavalry-centric warfare. Crucially, however, the surrounding hills, with their dense trees and rocky formations, offered ideal concealment for an army. If the Mamluks could successfully entice the Mongols into the valley and then launch a surprise assault from these elevated positions, they could neutralize the Mongols' superior mobility and force them into an engagement better suited for heavier cavalry and infantry. This audacious plan demanded flawless execution, unwavering discipline, and a significant degree of fortune. Yet, it represented their only viable path to victory. On the evening of September 2, 1260, Kutuz strategically positioned the majority of his forces within the hills surrounding Ain Jalut, cleverly hidden amidst the foliage and rocks. Baibars was tasked with leading a small vanguard, perhaps a few thousand cavalry, positioning them directly in the valley as a lure. When the Mongol army made their appearance, Baibars would engage them, provoke them, and then initiate a feigned retreat, drawing them deeper into the valley towards the hills where Kutuz and the main army lay concealed. This was a direct inversion of the Mongols' own signature tactic, a student preparing to deliver a profoundly painful lesson to the master. If you're captivated by this narrative and eager to witness the confluence of historical accuracy with cinematic storytelling, please leave a comment below. Imagine yourself as Baibars, awaiting the formidable Mongol army with a meager force while your main contingent is hidden in the hills. What thoughts would be racing through your mind? This is precisely the predicament he faced at dawn on September 3, 1260. As the sun ascended over the Jezreel Valley on that September morning, Kitpaka's Mongol army advanced from the north. The Mongol general radiated supreme self-assurance. He had fought for decades alongside Hulagu, participated in the conquest of Baghdad, and witnessed Damascus's surrender without a fight. He commanded battle-hardened veterans who had never known permanent defeat. When his scouts reported a Mamluk force obstructing the valley ahead, Kitpaka likely smiled. Finally, the Egyptians were prepared to stand and fight rather than hide behind their fortifications. This encounter, he surely believed, would be swift. Kitpaka's army comprised not only Mongols, but also auxiliary troops from subjugated regions, including Armenian cavalry, Christian Georgian soldiers, and Syrian warriors. The Syrians, however, were held in reserve. Kitpaka harbored doubts about their loyalty, fearing defection should the tide of battle turn against him. Baibars, watching from the valley floor with his small vanguard, must have felt his mouth go dry as the immense Mongol army arrayed itself for battle. Despite knowing Kutuz was concealed in the hills with the main Mamluk army, and that this was all part of the overarching strategy, the sight of the Mongol forces arrayed for battle must have been utterly terrifying. The Mongols adopted their customary battle formation. Light cavalry, armed with composite bows, spearheaded the assault, ready to pepper the adversary with arrows, while heavier cavalry lurked behind, poised to exploit any vulnerabilities. This was a tactical arrangement that had brought them uninterrupted success against every foe for half a century. However, Bibars possessed a strategic edge unknown to Kitbuka. He had meticulously positioned his troops so the Mongols would be facing eastward, directly into the rising sun. The morning glare would impair their vision, making it difficult to discern Mamluk movements clearly. This might seem a minor detail, but in the heat of combat, such seemingly insignificant elements can escalate into decisive advantages. The battle commenced precisely as Kitbuka anticipated, with Bibars launching his cavalry forward to engage the Mongol vanguard. Arrows filled the sky from both sides, accompanied by the screams of men and horses and the seismic rumble of hooves. Yet Bibar's objective in this initial skirmish wasn't victory. It was provocation. He aimed to sting and infuriate the Mongols. His cavalry would charge in, unleash a volley of arrows, then swiftly withdraw before the Mongols could close for hand-to-hand combat. This classic hit-and-run tactic was designed to wear down and enrage the enemy, and it proved remarkably effective. For several hours, Bibar's smaller contingent skirmished with the Mongols, darting in and out without committing to a full engagement. The Mongols, accustomed to adversaries who either immediately broke and fled or stood their ground to the last, found this immensely frustrating. They craved a decisive confrontation, eager to leverage their superior numbers and tactics to crush this persistent annoyance once and for all. Kitbuka, exasperated, ordered a more aggressive assault, sending additional cavalry forward, pressing harder, intent on pinning down Bibar's forces and annihilating them. The Mamluks fought with desperation, but they were numerically outmatched and steadily being forced backward. Then, precisely according to plan, Bibar signaled for retreat. His cavalry wheeled around, fleeing southward down the valley towards the hills where Kutus lay in wait. To the Mongols, this appeared to be exactly what they expected. The Mamluks, after a valiant struggle, were finally crumbling under pressure. Now was the opportune moment to pursue, to decimate the fleeing foe before they could reassemble. Kitbuka commanded the pursuit. The Mongol cavalry, sensing imminent victory, charged after the retreating Mamluks. This was their forte, the chase, the pursuit, the final eradication of a broken enemy. Their adrenaline surged, they thirsted for the kill. The Bibar's cavalry streamed down the valley, with the Mongols in close pursuit. The valley progressively narrowed as they neared Ain Jalut, with hills closing in from both flanks. Trees and rocks dotted the slopes, but the Mongols barely registered them, their gaze fixed on the fleeing Mamluks ahead. From atop a hill, Kutus observed the Mongol army pouring into the valley like water filling a bottle. This was the critical juncture. If he sprung the trap too soon, the Mongols could simply withdraw from the valley. If he delayed too long, his vanguard would be annihilated, and the Mongols might discern they were riding into an ambush. He waited, the tension undoubtedly unbearable. His officers watched him, awaiting his command. The Mongols drew nearer to the concealed Mamluk positions in the hills. Closer. Closer. Finally, Kutus gave the order, and the hills erupted with warriors. From three directions, Mamluk cavalry and infantry burst forth from their hiding places among the trees and rocks. War drums thundered. Arabic battle cries reverberated off the valley walls. The Mongols, stretched out in a long pursuit formation, suddenly found themselves encircled. To their credit, the Mongols did not panic. These were seasoned soldiers who had faced ambushes before. They attempted to wheel around to form a defensive circle, aiming to use their discipline and training to fight their way out. But they were fighting uphill, quite literally. The Mamluks were charging down from the hillsides, with gravity amplifying the force of their assault. The rocky terrain, which had gradually worn down the unprotected hooves of the Mongol ponies, now became a significant detriment. Their horses stumbled on loose rocks, slipped on the uneven ground, and their damaged hooves made them slower and less agile. Conversely, the Mamluk horses, protected by iron shoes, charged down the rocky slopes without hesitation. The Mamluks unleashed a devastating volley of arrows from multiple directions. Mongol cavalry attempted to retaliate with their own archery, but they were firing uphill while simultaneously under attack from three sides. Then, the Mamluks introduced a weapon the Mongols had never encountered: hand cannons. These rudimentary firearms, known as midfa in Arabic, were admittedly crude by contemporary standards. These initial weapons were essentially metal tubes packed with gunpowder, launching a projectile with a resounding bang and a plume of smoke. Their accuracy was questionable, and they weren't primarily designed for direct fatalities among the Mongols. Their true purpose was to instill terror in the horses. Mongol war horses were meticulously trained to maintain composure in combat, accustomed to ignoring the shouts of injured warriors and the clang of steel. However, they had never encountered anything akin to the explosive detonation of gunpowder weaponry. When a midfa discharged, Mongol horses would rear up, buck wildly, and bolt, unseating their riders and shattering formations. In the ensuing pandemonium, the Mamluk heavy cavalry surged into the disarrayed Mongol ranks. Here, the greater weight and superior armor of the Mamluk horses became decisive advantages in the close-quarters melee that ensued. The more formidable Mamluk cavalry could literally bowl over the less heavily equipped Mongol horsemen. Their armor absorbed impacts that would have been lethal to the lighter armored Mongols. Their lances and swords, crafted for close combat, proved more effective in the tight press of the fight than the Mongol composite bows. The engagement stretched on for several weeks. The Mongols found themselves relentlessly pursued, and the very rocky terrain that had impeded them during the conflict now proved utterly catastrophic during their retreat. Cavalrymen, mounted on exhausted horses with damaged hooves, attempted to escape across unfamiliar rugged ground, all while being chased by fresh Mamluk cavalry on shod mounts. The outcome was a massacre. Although the Mongols briefly regrouped at Basin to attempt to stand, they were swiftly overwhelmed. By day's end, the Mongol army, which had previously extended its conquests from Baghdad to Damascus, was virtually annihilated. Thousands of Mongol warriors lay dead in the valley. For the first time in over half a century, a Mongol army had been decisively vanquished in open battle and would never return to exact vengeance for the loss. Immediately following the battle, Kutuz executed a move he knew would resonate throughout the medieval world. He had Kitbuka's head severed, impaled on a spear, and dispatched to Cairo, where it was publicly displayed on the Bab Zuwayla Gate. Consider the powerful symbolism of this act. Mere months prior, Kutuz had executed Mongol envoys and exhibited their heads on this identical gate. The Mongols had responded by dispatching their armies, supremely confident that Egypt would fall, just like every other kingdom that had dared to resist them. Instead, the head of their own general now adorned the same gate, serving as a grim retort to Hulagu Khan's threats. News of Ain Jalut cascaded across the medieval world with astonishing speed. Cairo erupted in street celebrations. In the ruins of Baghdad, as well as in Damascus and Aleppo, indeed everywhere the Mongols had previously conquered, people began to murmur, speculating that perhaps, just perhaps, the Mongols were not as unconquerable as once believed. The Mamluks did not merely halt their advance defensively. Within days of the engagement, they pressed northward and reclaimed Damascus. Within a single month, they had retaken Aleppo. Syria, which had been under Mongol dominion for only a few short months, was thus restored to Muslim control. The Mamluk Sultanate would subsequently govern Egypt and the Levant for more than 250 years. However, the narrative takes an ironic and tragic turn at this juncture. On the triumphant march back to Cairo, Sultan Kutuz made a fatal misstep. He had promised Baybars, the general who had conceived and flawlessly executed the brilliant ambush strategy, that he would be granted Syria as his own administrative domain. Yet Kutuz either had a change of heart or asked Baybars to defer his claim. The precise details of their exchange remain unclear. What is known is that Baybars, an ambitious and ruthless general who had just played a pivotal role in saving the Islamic world, conspired with other Mamluk officers. On October 24, 1260, less than 2 months after the monumental victory at Ain Jalut, Baybars and his co-conspirators assassinated Qutuz during a hunting expedition. They justified the killing by asserting that Qutuz had failed to honor his commitments. Nevertheless, it was unequivocally an assassination fueled by ambition and avarice. Baybars subsequently declared himself the new Sultan of Egypt, and remarkably, he proved to be quite effective. Under his reign, the Mamluks would complete the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land, notably capturing Acre in 1291, thereby ending 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant. He would also repel subsequent Mongol attempts to invade Syria, establishing the Mamluk Sultanate as the dominant power in the Middle East for generations. Yet, one cannot help but reflect on Qutuz. Here was a man enslaved by the Mongols, who rose through the Mamluk system, made the courageous decision to fight rather than surrender, and risked everything to confront an seemingly invincible foe. He secured the victory that preserved Islamic civilization in the Middle East and North Africa. His reward? Assassination by his own subordinate. History often unfolds in such complex ways, rarely offering the neat, morally gratifying conclusions we desire. Qutuz deserved to be enshrined as a hero. Instead, he lay dead within weeks of his greatest triumph, slain by the very man he had elevated and entrusted. Meanwhile, in Azerbaijan, Hulagu Khan received news of the devastating defeat at Ain Jalut. True to Kitbaka's forewarning, he was enraged. He immediately began planning a colossal invasion to avenge the loss and utterly crush Egypt. However, he never got the chance. Recall Burqa Khan, the ruler of the Golden Horde in Russia. Burq had embraced Islam and was utterly appalled by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the execution of the caliph. He viewed these acts as an unforgivable transgression against the Islamic faith. Furthermore, Burq believed that Hulagu had seized territory in the Caucasus that rightfully belonged to the Golden Horde. Therefore, Burq took an unprecedented step in Mongol history. He allied with the Mamluks against a fellow Mongol ruler and declared war on Hulagu. This marked the beginning of a civil war within the Mongol Empire, pitting Mongol against Mongol. In 1263, Hulagu led an army northward to confront Burq. The 2 Mongol forces clashed in the Caucasus, and Hulagu suffered a substantial defeat. He subsequently dedicated his life to combating Burq's forces in the northern territories, instead of pursuing an invasion of Egypt in the south. His demise in 1265. History is replete with pivotal instances where a single death, a critical decision, or a strategic alliance completely reshapes outcomes. We often prefer narratives that present clear chains of cause and effect, featuring distinct heroes and villains, leading to seemingly predetermined conclusions. However, reality is frequently far more chaotic and dependent on chance than we care to acknowledge. Nevertheless, I have no intention of diminishing the remarkable bravery and skill exhibited by the Mamluk warriors at Ain Jalut. They confronted an adversary renowned for its terrifying reputation, a force that had utterly annihilated every kingdom daring to resist it. They understood that defeat would almost certainly condemn Cairo to the same fate as Baghdad: total devastation. They fought with every ounce of their being. Their victory was a testament to their fusion of courage with intellect and valor with astute strategy. Furthermore, Qutuz, despite the tragic end to his own story, merits recognition for making the audacious choice to engage rather than capitulate. It would have been easy to rationalize surrender. The Mongols had even offered to allow him to retain his throne as a vassal. He could have argued that by avoiding battle, he was preserving Egyptian lives, yet he chose confrontation, and that singular choice safeguarded Islamic civilization across the Middle East. Today, should you visit the historical site of the Battle of Ain Jalut, you'll discover agricultural fields within the Mayan Harod National Park in northern Israel. There stands no grand monument, no visitor center complete with gift shops or audio guides. the precise location of the battle itself remains somewhat ambiguous, largely because medieval chroniclers were not meticulous in recording exact coordinates. Yet the spring endures. The surrounding hills still embrace the valley, and if you stand upon the slopes of Mount Gilboa, gazing out over the Jezreel Valley, you can envision what Kutus beheld on that September morning in 1260. A valley floor that would tantalize any cavalry general, hills perfectly suited for an ambush, and the approaching forces of an army convinced of its own invincibility. The narrative of Ain Jalut serves as a potent reminder that every empire, regardless of its might, possesses limitations. These constraints may be geographical, logistical, or political, but they are undeniably present. The Mongol Empire, which spanned from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, encountered its western boundary in a rugged valley in northern Palestine, where their horses' hooves met ground they were ill-equipped to navigate. It also underscores that intimate knowledge of local conditions can be as crucial as superior numbers or advanced weaponry. Baibars was intimately familiar with the terrain. He knew precisely where to conceal an army, where to execute an ambush, and how to exploit the disadvantages that the rocky ground would impose upon unshoeing horses. That local expertise, coupled with the audacity to utilize it, proved to be the decisive factor. Perhaps most significantly, Ain Jalut impresses upon us that history is forged through choices. Kutus elected to fight instead of surrendering. Baibars opted to devise a perilous ambush rather than confront the Mongols in open battle. Kitbuka chose to pursue the feigning retreat of the Mamluks rather than suspecting a ruse. Each of these decisions generated consequences that reverberated throughout history. Before concluding, I'm keen to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Tell me, do you believe Kutus's assassination by Baibars was justifiable, or was it a betrayal of a hero? Do you think the Mongols might have conquered Europe had they vanquished the Mamluks? What other historical battles do you feel warrant this kind of in-depth exploration? Your comments genuinely help me determine what topics to delve into next, so please don't hesitate to share your perspectives. If you found this video engaging, please take 3 actions. First, hit that like button. It genuinely assists more people in discovering these narratives. Second, subscribe and activate that notification bell, as I have many more stories like this on the horizon, covering battles, technologies, and the peculiar geographical elements that altered the course of history. And third, share this video with anyone who has a passion for history, because stories of this caliber are simply too compelling to keep to yourself. Remember, the secret behind crushing the Mongols wasn't some superweapon or divine intervention. It was horseshoes, grass, and rocky hills. It was brilliantly applied local knowledge. It was the understanding that the ground beneath your feet can be just as critical as the weapon in your hand. The Mongols forged the largest land empire in history, but at Ain Jalut, they learned that there's always terrain where even the mightiest army cannot advance. Sometimes, terrain dictates destiny. And on September 3, 1260, the landscape of the Jezreel Valley determined the